Hello everyone, today I'm here with my friend Nevada and we are going to analyze a very peculiar video on the internet, one that has been gone rather unnoticed around the wider community, especially in history and politics, of a certain individual called Brandon F. As an individual with a very interesting backstory, which I'm not going to analyze, but we are going, more exactly, to speak about his masterpiece of content on YouTube.
This is
Amazing.
bound to be pretty good, huh, Wolfgang?
Oh, indeed, a masterpiece.
This is the biggest crossover yet since Infinity War.
But oh boy, I mean, our individual here, which apparently not very like. Which I would argue that he has a very noticeable fetish when it comes to British history. That is very obvious from his various thumbnails. But he decided to make a piece when it comes to World War One. As everyone knows, World War One was a conflict that has altered human history forever. A conflict that has brought down an entire. It has basically started the decline of Europa, a continent that was the masters of the world for ages, you know. And he decided to make this video. Why World War One was not
pointless.
Exactly.
So I think, without further ado, we are about to get into the video. I would just like to say, enjoy our response, and I hope you enjoy this video.
From the British perspective, the First World War is oftentimes viewed as an unnecessary, a pointless, and avoidable tragedy. A one that didn't have to happen had only cooler heads prevailed. Something that only ever resulted in the loss of millions, and the ruination of millions of British lives. Now, sure, the French and the Russians, they had no choice but really to go to war because they were continental powers.
Well, this is something back. Of course, it is very hard to say what is the British perspective. Of course, a perspective usually, people have different opinions, I'm pretty sure. I mean, I am not educated on what the majority of English people think, so I'm not going to touch on the subject. However, to say that the British saw the war as what's the word? Not inevitable, but while the Russians and French do not, because they were apparently had no choice, I find that a bit dishonest to say that.
Oh yeah, dishonest.
I mean, even not. Like, World War One was a conflict that had many reasons to start. That the French are not very happy that the war began. The war was fought on France. Much more Frenchmen died. The Russians may have various reasons. Many even will say, and I know that many, for example, during the Russian Revolution, many Russians felt that the war could have been avoided. They were continental powers. Yes, that doesn't mean that the war was inevitable for them. Britain, had its empire and had little presence in Europe. Yes, that doesn't mean that they were not pushed into the war or something. Just because you are continental power doesn't mean you were forced into World War One. Italy was arguably a continental power. You can argue about that for a long time, but they did not join the war immediately. They joined the next year because of a promise. As I said, the war was not something that happened and then everyone was forced to join in. The war had various causes, various reasons. Everyone had their interests. Each government had their interests of what to gain and etc. It is very ingenuous to say that they were pushed into the war and had no choice whatsoever. Yes, you can argue that France was pushed into the war. Germany declared war on France. But that is to ignore the fact, why did the Germans declare war on France? The Germans did not just wake up one day and say, hey, let's declare war on France. There was pretty good reasons. The Russians, they did not they declared the war first on Austria. They had the choice not to do so. They were not forced into the war. They chose to fight it. The French, in a way, you can argue, if they did not sign, did, for example, agreements with Russia, the Russo-French alliance, they chose to stand with Russia. They did not declare neutrality, which was one of the big points of the Germans. The Germans said, "Hey, France, declare neutrality or we declare war." The French ignore it. Yeah, they had a choice. You can, that comes to arguing. You can argue that, oh, but even if they had, the Germans would have blah 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 blah. Like, yeah, but in technicality, they all had a choice. The wars are not declared just because yes. There's no randomly declare war. That is simply untrue.
They were under attack by Germany, by Austria. The war was brought to them. They had, especially in the case of France, to defend themselves.
No, they were not defending themselves. For once, we can speak about how the war started. World War I started because a Serbian shot an Austrian with a gun that came from Serbia. That's how the war started. For once, we can even look at the timeline. Russia mobilized on the 31st of July. And only in the 1st of August was when Germany declared war on on Russia. Germany only declared war on Russia after they mobilized against Austria. Germany was defending Austria. It was a defensive move to protect their ally. France is an even good case, because Germany wanted to make sure that France was neutral, and they may even try to speak with the French to assure their neutrality. France not only ignored it, but on the same day Germany declared war on Russia, they mobilized against Russia. And it was only on the 3rd of August that 2 days later that Germany declared war on France, after France had mobilized against Germany. And it was only on the 11th of August that France declared war on Austria. They were not defending themselves. They were on the offensive. They were moving against the Central Powers. The Central Powers took a defensive measure. Yes, Germany declared war on Russia and France. But they did not declare war on them as an aggressive move. They declared war on them because those two were mobilizing against Germany. Germany was on the defensive in that move. There's a very big difference.
The United Kingdom was defended by the English Channel, by the Navy. They were not a continental power. They did not have to go to war to defend themselves. Their going to war was absolutely a choice, and indeed, the British were the ones who declared war on Germany, not the other way around. And again, what did they achieve? What did they actually gain in the end, other than, well, a few imperial possessions, sure.
A few imperial possessions. Well, for once, Britain managed to defeat its biggest rival, the German Empire, which were their main competitors when it came to industry. They were the ones that were trying to challenge their naval superiority. They assured that their imperial monopoly would be secure for German. They also assured control of vast territories in the Middle East, from Palestine, Jordan, Iraq. They betrayed the Arabs in the process, of course. They also assured the influence on Persia. They assured the influence on Saudi Arabia. They also assured their influence on Egypt. Don't forget that. They also assured their influence over German Africa and the many colonies in the Pacific. They also assured the influence on Asia, which were German colonies in Qingdao and etc. Not to mention, most of the quote-unquote few imperial conquests that they had, for example in the Middle East, was full of oil. Isn't that nice? And oil was a pretty important thingy after the Second Industrial Revolution. Also, after when it came to taking control of German colonial possessions, it is interesting that in particular they took control of German Tanganyika. Which, how interesting of that, allowed them to build their famous railway from the Cape to Cairo. They also curbed German influence over the world. They also curbed the influence of most of their rivals in the world, because who else was going to challenge them? They're sure they had a bigger monopoly, as I said. That doesn't seem to me about just a few gains, if you catch my meaning.
But certainly nothing that was worth the loss of all those millions of lives. The war was a tragedy, an avoidable tragedy. This is oftentimes how the war is seen in popular culture, that ultimately it should not have been fought, and the only reasons why it was fought were bad ones. This is a narrative which I disagree with, extraordinarily so. Rather, the First World War was not a pointless conflict. It was not a senseless slaughter. It was not without its reasons, without its causes. It was not an unjust war. Not for the British, not for the French, not for their allies. Indeed, the most moral thing, I dare say, the most just thing, and not only that, but the most logical thing which the British people could have done in 1914 was send forward their ultimatum to the German nation and indeed declare war upon them.
Just war. Just war. Holy war. Justice. What about our side, you know? The Central Empires. What about the Germans? What about the Austrians? Austria-Hungary was defending itself after terrorists, sponsored by the Serbian state, shot an Austrian archduke. You know? Not to mention that that assassination came following a trend of terrorist attacks on Austrian soil, and whose terrorists, most of their guns, usually found their way coming right from the Serbian army depots, and would more often than not escape over the border into Serbia, escaping justice from Austrian authorities. What about our justice?
And not
Weren't
to,
we just?
and not to mention the fact that the Kingdom of Serbia in that time propagated this myth of pan-Slavism and wanted to basically unite all the South Slavs in their lands, which led to them sponsoring some activities, mainly pro-Serbian activities in Austro-Hungarian land, primarily in Bosnia, because Bosnia had a good number of Serbs in it, and which eventually led to the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand because of those Serbian terrorists who were sponsored by the Serbian government under this disguise of quote-unquote pan-Slavism.
Exactly. What about our justice? Does he think that we were monsters that decided to go to war? Does he think we had our reasons? We were avenging years of assassinations, of bombings. The assassination of Franz Ferdinand was not just he got shot, let's go to war. It was the last straw. You know, we were tolerating terrorist attacks for years, decades. Once they shot the Archduke, Austria simply said, enough. We won't accept this anymore. We won't allow this anymore. And we sent out demands. We were fighting for our justice. Justice over the man who died. Justice over the killing of a man and his pregnant wife by a coward whose pistol came directly from the Serbian army. A man whose bullet was financed by Serbian ministers. For years, the Serbian ministers had terrorized not only the Austrian state, but the people, Bosniaks, Croats, Hungarians. They were terrorized. What about them? Where is the justice for them?
And there's also another thing to add up to that. Basically, the Central Powers are always demonized in Western culture as these bad guys who have no morals, and this was mainly caused by how the Germans acted towards the Belgians and others, and basically the Central Powers got this bad moral look. But there's one interesting event that happened after the declaration of war against Serbia. A Serbian field marshal, I don't know exactly his name, he was in Austria-Hungary at that time when war broke out. So instead of, executing him, the Austrians secured him a safe path towards Serbia back, where he would later wage war against Austria.
And where is our justice? Where is it? The Germans were simply honoring the treaties they had with us, with Austria. They were simply defending their allies. They were defending Austria from Russian aggression. They were defending what the treaties we had together. They were making justice to the treaties they had signed. Are we not just for upholding the rights of nations to defend themselves, to defend their allies, and to defend their homes from those who threaten them? Where is the justice for us? Where is our justice?
Now, in fairness, could the ultimatum that ultimately launched Britain into the war have been sent earlier, before Germany attacked Belgium? Yes, obviously it could have. Maybe that would have actually played a role.
No, it couldn't. Belgium was not a British protectorate. Belgium was a sovereign nation, a neutral nation who had no business with the war until the Germans attacked. The British had no say when it comes to Belgium. You know, the Belgians decided that. You know, the British could not send, no one could send troops to Belgium. You know why? Because Belgium is an independent nation. The Belgians decided their future. They were not some puppets, for fuck's sake.
Perhaps they could have laid down the terms of their alliance with France much more firmly, and indeed given proper warnings to Germany. Hey, if you attack France, we will go in to aid them. If you attack through Belgium, we will go in to aid them. They could have done things better. Yes, absolutely. And indeed, is it possible that war could have been avoided? Maybe it could have been, had everything been a little bit different.
Maybe. War could have been avoided if someone didn't shot an Austrian Archduke with a gun that came from Serbia. That's the easiest way to stop World War I, my friend.
Although, in fairness, given the powder keg that was Europe, I think we can say ultimately the war would have started eventually anyways. It just depends on the circumstances under which it does, but that's beside the point.
Ironically coming from a guy who's defending a nation that had a questionable reputation when they dealt with sovereign nations in South Africa, with the Boers. You know, that's the reason why the Nazis copied British camps in South Africa.
Given the events that happened up to 1914 and up to the beginning of the war, I dare say that the British people truly had no other option but to go to war, and their decision to go to war was a purely moral one, and, well, there are other interests involved, of course, but it was a wholly, I should say, moral one. It was a good one. Really, had the British decided to not go to war in 1914, they would have damned themselves in more ways than one, many more ways than one. The First World War was not a pointless conflict, but a genuine crusade in many ways against Imperial Germany, against the Kaiserreich, and one which could not have been avoided.
What moral reason? What morality? I have a friend of mine that said, the British didn't die in the trenches to save the Belgians. The British died in the trenches to build a railway in Africa and to stop the Germans from building a railway in Turkey. Belgium was not a British protectorate. It was an independent nation which owed nothing to Britain. British goals were not some moralistic bullshit or holy crap. They were neo-imperialists. As we three were everyone else's goals.
And he's forgetting one thing. World War I was not a war about morality. It was a clash of empires. It wasn't something where you can just say, oh, for example, you support Germany in World War I, okay, you hate that and that. No, it was a war where all sides were fighting amongst themselves without any fucking, you know what I mean, like in World War II. Yeah, for an ideology, yeah. They were fighting because they wanted to expand their empire. That was the fucking reason, to expand their influence. That was the thing World War I was about. Not some fucking war about morality. Like, for example, the Central Powers have a good reason why they went to war. They didn't just declare war because, oh, you know what? I want war and kill these people. Why not?
Yeah, not to mention, like, Belgium was an excuse by the British. You know? the Treaty of London that the British invoked to enter the war to protect Belgian neutrality from other nations, the treaty was not about, if someone attacked Belgium, you have to defend Belgium. No. The treaty simply said that Britain and whatever, they were to keep Belgium neutral. Meaning, they were to make sure that Belgium, did not side with, other nations, that Belgians did not decide not to go military alliances, stuff like that, The treaty was supposed to make Belgium, Britain was conquering lands in Africa, Germany was fighting one another. The treaty was to stop Belgium from doing what everyone was doing during the imperialist age. The only thing that the British did in World War I was they looked at the treaty and said, no. This is not about us keeping Belgium neutrality. This is about us enforcing Belgium neutrality. Because there's a very big difference from securing a nation neutrality and securing a nation independence. When the Germans invaded Belgium, they threatened Belgium independence, which no one had guaranteed. They guaranteed that the country, the Belgian politicians, the Belgian nation would not stop from being neutral. It's basically like the Austrians. If the Swiss want, for example, invade France for whatever reason, the Austrians going to Switzerland said, you cannot do that. You cannot invade France, for example. It has nothing to do about defending them. And the British twisted the world. They did that. What they did was wrong. Who cares? It was their reason to enter the war. Everyone did that. Everyone, it was basically, they needed a justification for the war. And Belgium was that justification. Doesn't matter what the treaty said. The only thing that mattered, it was a way for them to justify the war. That was what Belgium was.
Not if the future of the British people, of the Empire, and indeed the honour of old England, if you want to get romantic about it, could ever hope to be preserved.
First of all, fuck off! The Kaiser Wilhelm II, did not care about Britain. If anything, Wilhelm II wanted to appease the British. Don't forget, Wilhelm II had wanted to ally the British. Of course, he was retarded and useless in doing that, but he still did not want to threaten the British. That was never his goal. The Kaiser had no intention against Britain. Britain safety and security, integrity was never in question when the war started. For a simple reason. The war did not start because of Britain. The war simply started because Austria was attacked by Russia. England had nothing to do with it.
And not to mention that it was in the Central Powers' interest for Britain to not intervene at all. If anything, they wanted Britain to stay neutral, as much as possible.
Exactly. It was a war of imperialism. And that was basically what it. And speaking about honor, English honor, he says. What honor? What the fuck is he speaking about? For the Dutch are still waiting for Britain to return them South Africa since the Napoleonic Wars. Where was English honor when the Boers were dying in concentration camps that would inspire the Nazis later on? Where was British honor when they blockaded Germany, not allowing neither neutral ships or even humanitarian aid to reach Germany when its citizens were starving to death? Where was English honor when they violated Greek neutrality? Where was English honor when they plotted to divide Portugal's colonies? Remember, Portugal was England's oldest ally. They plotted to divide their colonies with the Germans right before World War I. Where was English honor when they used a civilian ship, the Lusitania, to carry war material, something that is against the Geneva Convention? And when the Germans sank the ship with U-boats, it only took 18 minutes to sink a massive ocean liner. You know why? Because the ship was carrying 4 million rounds of machine gun ammunition, 5K sharp-nail shells casings, basically 50 tons, and almost 3K brass percussions of artillery fuses. That is against the Geneva Convention. The Lusitania was a civilian ship. It was not supposed to carry war material. Yet the British did it. They violated the Geneva Convention. And even though the Germans made sure to tell everybody on the ship that the ship was a legitimate military target. Before the ship sailed from America, the German consulate made sure made sure that every passenger on the Lusitania knew that it was a risk to be on the ship. They literally told them. They went out of their way to tell everybody. Even after that, the British still blamed the Germans for the sinking, for the deaths. Of course, not after trying to blame the ship's captain. They first tried to blame the captain of the Lusitania. They tried to get him arrested or executed because they wanted to save face of the English Navy, of the English war effort. Because the English war effort were the real guilty ones. They first tried to blame the captain, but the judge took pity on the captain, and thankfully the captain did not have his wife ruined or even ended by what the British did. So what they did, they blamed the Germans for a quote-unquote crime. A crime that was no crime at all. They sank a legitimate military ship. And they made the Germans look like monsters that killed children. When in reality, the ship only sank because the cargo hold was full of illegal military equipment. It speaks about honor. If anything, World War I showed the world that whatever honor the English still had was no more. England had no longer honor after they entered World War I.
Now allow me to explain myself here, because I understand it's very much going against the grain to suggest that the First World War was indeed a noble and good conflict, if also a one in which obviously an extraordinary number of tragedies did take place.
A good conflict. A war where men were sent to basically a true meat grinder, Men had their feet eaten by rats on trenches, where human suffering was so big that only World War II could rivals it. Was good. This guy speaks a lot about morality, but his moral compass is quite interesting, ain't it?
Yeah, it seems like it.
But indeed, I think, much like the Second World War is oftentimes viewed as a moral, as a just war in fighting against the just unequivocal terror and evil of Nazi Germany, well, I think that the First World War deserves a bit more credit along those sorts of lines as well. Now, obviously, Imperial Germany, the Kaiserreich, was nowhere near the absolute evil that Nazi Germany was, but it was, when compared with other powers at the time, really quite nasty in their own right.
A moral one. You literally cannot compare World War I and World War II by morality means. For example, there is one big difference he is ignoring. Has Germany committed war crimes in World War I? Yes, it has. But there is one key difference, because he does not realize that there's a difference between state-sponsored terror and terror that was done individually by armies. That's the main difference. For example, in the German World War Army, definitely they did some war crimes, but they were never state-enforced. Kaiser Wilhelm didn't command, go rape Belgian women. No, he didn't command that. Those actions were carried out by the division commanders and the soldiers. They were independent. But when compared to World War II, where the state itself, Hitler himself, had ordered the mass execution of Jews, is another thing.
It does compare Imperial Germany, who literally did, the Nazis gassed millions of Jews, Slavs, gays, they gassed them in concentration camps. How is that comparable to Nazi Germany? How, every nation did war crimes. The British did war crimes, yes, in both wars. Everyone did war crimes. But no one gassed millions of Jews. To say that they are comparable in any form, substance, or whatever, is an insult. This is insulting the people who died in concentration camps. This is an authentic insult. Those who perished in the Nazism, you dare compare them? It is an insult, a very elaborate joke or this guy has no self-awareness. And not to say they were nasty in their own right compared to other powers. Like, you're gonna tell me that the Germans were worse than the Holocaust against the Boers that the British did in South Africa, or the pogroms against Jews that the Russians had, or the Dreyfus affairs in France, or the lynching of Black Americans and the KKK, or the Irish famine, or the genocide of Christians in China. The 19th century is a pretty messed up age. Yes, some things were done bad, but what the Germans did is far from nasty compared to others. When you look deeper, maybe the country that has been for centuries a power, centuries before the Germans, maybe they also did some messed up things. That's the reason why the Nazis, when they made the concentration camps, they took inspiration in the British. I wonder why. It was not because it was fancy. Yes, the Germans did messed up things in Southwest Africa, as did the British, as did the Belgians, the Congo. There were some massive things there. China, Japan, Russia, France, Austria, everyone did massive things. The Germans are not unique, You can capitalize on the rape of Belgium. Yeah, if you look at the rape of Belgium in 1940, yeah, the Germans did massive things. And you're gonna ignore what the British did, for example, anywhere, because there was crimes everywhere happening during World War I. To blame the Germans, yes, you should blame the Germans for the crime, but there's a difference between blaming the Germans for something they did wrong and say they were bad because they did that and act as like no one else did crimes like that. Like, for fuck's sake, let's be consistent here, because the British, in many times, were worse, If you want to blame the Germans, yes, I will agree, but let's blame the British. You cannot act as if the Germans were alone doing this. That is dishonest. Simply put.
Yeah, and also let's not forget all the crimes Britain did in India.
Yeah, and don't even tell me that is whataboutism. It is not about whataboutism. This is about comparison, Whataboutism is say they were bad because X, and then you say, oh, what about the British? No, it is not about it. This is simply underlining a fact that what the Germans did, was what everyone else did. Yes, what they did was wrong, but there's a big difference between saying the Germans did it and they were the only ones doing it, as like this guy is implying to. Because don't fuck with me, he is implying to. He's making the British look like saints. And that the Germans were purposely, like, every German wanted to rape Belgians. Which is a very different thing. What that is doing is propaganda. It's propaganda. When you speak about history, don't say, oh, the Germans did messed up, like, compared to the others, the Germans did a lot of messed up things. Yes, the Germans did a lot of messed up things. But compared to the others, they did, like, almost, I would say, even less messed up things, all things considered. You had the rape of Belgium, yeah. Like, there was not really any other, correct me if I'm wrong, and I'm probably going to be wrong because there's already exceptions. But overall, the Germans did not really had much big issues besides that when it comes to huge ass rapes. Not to mention that the rape of Belgium is exaggerated. Don't fuck with me, it was exaggerated. It was a crime, don't get me wrong, but it was exaggerated. But the British, for example, in Greece, the French, they also did that in Greece. In Palestine, everyone did that. It was normal. It is not something that, like, it is bad, but everyone did it. When you speak about this, you recognize that everyone did it. They were wrong, but they did it. And we shouldn't, like, nitpick. Like, oh, the Germans were bad because they did it. Because we should apply the same logic to everyone else. That's the point here.
Now, first things first, let's start off with Belgium. Because, of course, whenever we're talking about the British nation in the First World War, and particularly why they got into the conflict, you have to talk about Belgium, because that really is the entire reason for the British getting involved. At least it's the most immediate, the most direct reason for them getting involved. Belgium was, by treaty of the British and the Germans, they had signed on to this treaty earlier, a neutral country. The Germans had earlier promised that they would not engage Belgium in a potential war between great powers. Her neutrality was guaranteed by the nations of Europe.
Yes, the nations of Europe guaranteed Belgium neutrality. They guaranteed that Belgium would remain a neutral country, meaning that Belgium could not side with other nations in conflicts. The nations of Europe were not obligated to rush to Belgium's defense if Belgium was attacked. This is very different from guarantee of neutrality. The nations of Europe did not guarantee Belgium independence. They only guaranteed that Belgium could not have a side. They could not, have side alliances, whatever. There's a slight difference there. And the British utilized that. They pretty much twisted the wars around. This says, they said, well, let's make guarantee of neutrality that Belgium is neutral and you cannot attack Belgium. They twisted it in order to justify their actions. Because the original treaty did not had nothing to do about foreign invasion. Nothing. This was a tactic. There's nothing to do.
In 1914, the Germans realized that if they were going to have any hope of winning this two-front war, they had to knock France out right off the beginning, right off the bat, and in order to do so, the best possible way was to move through Belgium. It makes sense why they did it. There is a logical reason for it. It wasn't just pure malice. There's a logical reason why they went through Belgium. But all the same, that does not, because it makes sense, that does not justify the action. It was highly illegal according to their own treaties, but the Germans derided these treaties as mere scraps of paper in the world of realpolitik.
Yes, they invaded Belgium. So what? No country asks, can I invade Mr. Belgium? No one does it. Not to mention, the Treaty of London, the whole thing of Belgian neutrality, was a very controversial document because the Kingdom of Prussia signed the treaty. The German Empire didn't. Yes, Prussia unified Germany, but Prussia still existed. Germany was not a unitarian state. Prussia did not change its name to German Empire. No, the German Empire was a new state, of which Prussia was part of, the same way that Bavaria was part of it, or Saxony. The German emperor was German emperor and king of Prussia. Prussia and Germany were two distinct identities. The whole thing about the legality of the treaty, there is a very huge debate regarding it. And, debate in the end boils down to, if you are in favor of the Germans, you say that Germany did not sign the treaty. If you are against the Germans, you say Germany signed the treaty. That's what the debate boils down to. Because in practicality, who cares? The Germans wanted to go through Belgium. And they went through Belgium no matter what. The same way that the British went through Greece. The same way that everyone did everything. The same way that politics work. Politics are not a sky, a perfection where nothing wrong happens. That's not how things work. It's very different from the real world. Every nation understood that. The Germans understood that. The French understood that. The British understood that. To nitpick now, the Germans violated the treaty, here we go on, blah blah blah. That is simply, in the end, that is simply bullshit. To paint the Germans bad. This whole thing so far has been basically whitewashing the British and making the Germans look bad. There is no solid argument. No, it's just bullshit, moralistic crap that has no substance of its own and has no value.
Something that they can brush aside on an as-needed basis, and that's what they did. They attack Belgium, not really by surprise. A lot of people were expecting it, but people were hesitant to send soldiers in to reinforce Belgium because no one wanted to be seen as the first aggressor, that sort of thing.
No. They could not send soldiers to Belgium to reinforce Belgium. Belgium was, and still is, an independent country. I don't know what this idiot is coming from, but, you cannot just send an army to Belgium before the Germans declare war. That's not how things work. Belgium is not a British protectorate. It's an independent nation with its own army. It is not, you cannot do whatever you want to Belgium. And remember, Germany at first did not attack Belgium. They first requested for them to allow the German army to pass through Belgium. And you know what? Belgium refused. Because they decide what happens in the country. They decide who goes through and who doesn't go through Belgium. Don't forget that when the war started, Belgium was majority in favor of the Germans. The Belgian public was in favor of Austria. Don't forget that. The British could not do whatever they want to Belgium. They think they could do. But Belgium is not some random African kingdom. It's not the Boers. It's an actual European country. With a parliament, with a king, with the politics. The British are not masters of Belgium. Belgium decides what happens in that country. It's not the British who decide. It's not the French. To say otherwise is completely ridiculous.
This entire time, he just keeps going with the argument that Belgium was some sort of holy land for the British and they had to protect it at all costs, and they were under direct British influence.
But Belgians did not even like the British! Like, King Albert despised the British. During World War I, the British make sure that the Belgians were fighting before them, And they tried to do the same thing during World War II. The British never cared about the Belgians, so much so that when the Germany invaded and Belgium stood alone, the British, instead of going to the front to reinforce the Belgians, instead of helping the Belgians to defend Brussels, for example, Belgium's capital, they stood behind. They waited. They first let the Belgians do the fighting against the Germans, while they seated behind, waiting. Because when the Germans arrived to fight the British, they had already been fighting the Belgians. And so the Belgians were overwhelmed and alone, fighting, Belgium fought valiantly. King Albert I of Belgium fought in the trenches with his men. The British did not give a shit. So much so that they allowed the Belgians to die and allowed most of Belgium to be occupied except the Yser, because the Belgians refused to allow their country to be fully occupied. And no matter how much the British wanted, no matter how much the British just didn't care about Belgium, so they were sitting back in their trenches behind the Belgian lines, the Belgians refused and fought to the very last to keep at least one piece of Belgium free. That's a big difference.
But the Germans, when they attack Belgium, violate that neutrality. Now, the initial plan was for the Germans to move through Belgium, and perhaps if they did just move through Belgium, just walk along the streets, ignore the soldiers, ignore the towns, ignore the civilians, all that sort of thing, if they had just used Belgium as a highway of sorts, well then perhaps things may have ended differently.
Yes, the Germans wanted to do that. Do you know why they did not do that? Because Belgium said no. The Belgians refused to allow the Germans to pass by. And the Germans were forced to fight. Simple as it. I am half Belgian, and this fucking bullshit is quite offensive, I'm not gonna lie. He thinks that Belgians are some, fucking puppets that have no say in their country, like the Belgians have no say in our country. Fuck off, mate. The Belgians decide what happens in their country. Belgium is independent. The British may not know what independence is, because they treat everyone like they were colonies, but Belgium is independent. There's a big difference there.
Because with the invasion of Belgium, the British suddenly had the casus belli, if you will. They had the justification, the legal, the technical, if you will, justification to enter into the conflict, because, of course, they had signed a treaty with Belgium. And, of course, if at that point alone, when the German soldiers enter into Belgium, and in that way become the first aggressors of this new global war, from that point, if the British violated their treaty with Belgium, if they betrayed the trust that they had with the Belgian nation, and did not go to war in aid of them, as they had continually promised to do so, well, imagine the situation that would leave the British Empire in. After the war, who is to say that any of their allies would ever trust them again?
The Belgians did not expect the British to defend them now. King Albert I of Belgium knew that Britain would join the war, not because of the promise to defend Belgium, but because the British were looking for a reason to justify the entry of the war. Everyone in Belgium knew that. So much so that King Albert, the Belgians, refused to put their armies under British command. They did not trust the British. You know, the Belgians never trusted the British. They always feared what happened in World War II, which was the British letting the Belgians die first while they run away from Dunkirk. And the Belgians always never trusted. Like, even the French had their doubts about the British. Like, that is just objectively not true, that the trust or whatever.
The French and the Belgians would both despise the British, on whom they relied, in part at least, for their protection.
You're joking me. Are you absolutely joking me? The French did not rely on the British for protection. That in any way whatsoever. That is simply completely stupid. Like, from what the fuck did this idiot even took that from? Like, France. Like, you know where the war was fought throughout the entire Western Front? It was on French soil. The French gave the most blood. You know, their towns were destroyed. The French were willing to fight and did not rely. They had an empire on their own. They had their own navy. Now, Belgium, on the other case, yes, Belgium arguably. But no, you know, there's a thing there actually, because there's a difference between rely on someone to defend itself or rely on someone to survive. You know, because the Belgian army was more than enough. The Belgian army supplied itself. You know, they had their own guns. They never used British uniforms, British guns, British helmets. No, the Belgians supplied themselves. The Belgians did not need the British to fight. They fought alone. Of course, Belgium alone. You know, if Germany invaded Belgium, you know, they would defeat very hard. They could win. You know, that's a different story. You know, the same thing as Denmark being invaded by Russia. You know, they cannot win. But does that mean that they cannot defend themselves? And the Belgians defend themselves. They did not rely on anybody. That is like so stupid. It's literally offensive to the sacrifice and the heroic fight that the Belgians had, to the valiant efforts of the Belgians during World War I under King Albert I, the men who were in the trenches fighting with his men. You know, that is disgusting. That is not to mention, of course, that the French and Belgians never liked the British in the first place. Since when the British care about what the others think about? They surely didn't care when they betrayed the Arabs or sent their ultimatum against Portugal during the scramble of Africa. Let's not act like the British give much of a shit about France. They've been enemies for like the past centuries. The only reason why they are allies is because Germany is a bigger threat. They did not trust each other. Never did.
Are the British going to be able to go to Russia and start saying, hey, so we lost our allies over here, can you maybe, help us out with some treaties and whatnot? The Russians aren't going to agree, especially after the beating, the suffering that they had experienced in the war. Could they go to the United States, to the rest of their empire even? Could they look to Canada or Australia or the Union of South Africa and say, well, but we're still good, right? We're still buddies. I mean, yeah, we betrayed the other ones, but they weren't part of the dominions. They weren't part of the empire. We're still fine, right? No. The amount of diplomatic damage that would be done to the British nation would be so extraordinary that it would continue to have ripple effects throughout the rest, really, of British history. To betray a trust that was so very solidly signed, so to say.
Britain and Russia were rivals in Central Asia. They did not trust each other. Not only that, but Britain, remember that, Britain sided with Japan against the Russians, my dude. Also, are you gonna tell me that the British care about what the Dominions thought? Like, they were colonies in Albert name. Britain controlled them well into the 30s, and even arguably the 50s. The Dominions had no say, you know? Did you know that a choice? That is ludicrous, you know? It is stupid, like... not to mention, this is easily disproven by all the British betrayed the Arabs after World War I, you know? Like, if the British care so much about what everyone thought about them, why did they betray the Arabs, or the Japanese, and the White Russians after the war? They didn't care back then. Are you going to tell me that they literally cared just a few years after before those events? Like, come on. I mean, the Dutch are still waiting for the British to return South Africa to them to this day. Remember that? Since what does the British care about what the others think about? They did not need. They're an empire. Good job, for fuck's sake.
Would be a very, very bad move for them, again, diplomatically speaking. The only ones, really, that I think they'd be able to get along with at that point would be the Kaiserreich.
Hold on. Just give me a moment. Did he literally said the English and French having a, quote, very solidified trust?
Yeah.
The English and Frenchmen trust each other. Come on, please,
Like,
make me laugh harder.
they were literally rivals, as well as in terms of navy. Like they kept building up ships so they can dominate over the other's navy. Like they had this naval rivalry.
Like, even to this day, they never trust each other. Like, fuck this shit. Like, France and Britain. Since when do they trust each other? Since when they have a solidified trust? Come on. You can't make this shit up.
And the Kaiserreich had already shown themselves to be rather hostile to the concept of pieces of paper, scraps of paper, withholding the actions of nation-states and empire builders.
Ironic. The guy who's defending the British is telling me that the Kaiser did not care about, quote, pieces of paper.
Oh.
The one defending the British.
I wonder what happened in Arabia at that time after the war ended.
I mean, come on, dude. The English ain't known for being reliable allies. You can't make this shit up. Like, literally, tell me one time the British were reliable allies. Ask the Dutch and Portuguese for that.
Not a very good idea. But of course, the diplomatic aspect is only a very small part of it, because even still, when the Germans went in through Belgium, British public opinion, and of course in a democratic nation such as the United Kingdom at this time, public opinion sways many things, not necessarily everything, but many things indeed. And without public support in going to war, the British would find themselves in a very difficult situation trying to fight. Even if, yes indeed, on an official level they had promised to aid Belgium, they may have actually found themselves hamstrung, not really able to go to war, if the population did not stand in support of that war.
Yeah, exactly. That's why they fabricated the Belgian myth. And that's why they made the war to be a moralistic crap rather than just an imperialist war. You know, they had to justify it for the public. This is also why the rape of Belgium is over-exaggerated. It did happen, yeah. But it was not Germans crucifying men in the streets and eating babies. It's with the propaganda. That's the name of it. That's why you are here. It's propaganda. Nothing more.
What is it that made the British population stand so extraordinarily strongly in support of that conflict? That would be the rape of Belgium.
In other words, that would be propaganda.
Now hold on, Brandon, you may be saying, the rape of Belgium is Allied propaganda! Sure, there were some things that happened, but it wasn't anywhere near so bad as the Allied propagandists made it out to be. You know, if the Entente powers hadn't been telling these fabricated stories of peasants being crucified along the roads, or of babies being quite literally consumed by German soldiers, well then, the war would not have happened, and indeed, the British public would have realized that they would have known better. Had they been better informed, they would not have been willing to send their boys off to war. They would not have lost those millions and millions of lives. Sure, the British may have gone to war anyways because of those diplomatic reasons, but at least less lives would have been lost. The British would have been more willing to sign earlier peace treaties. They would not have been so very intense, so to say, in those first actions. Arguments like that can be made.
It tries to discredit the fact that the rape of Belgium was over-exaggerated. Also, people knowing the truth, you know, it tries to imply that no matter what, no matter if the people of Britain knew that the war was not moralistic, it was just not an imperialist war, it tries to portray that no matter what, Britain would still join the war, even if the public was aware of the sham that the rape of Belgium was, that they will still send their boys to die, and in literally the previous sentence, you know, he says that a war without the public support can be fought. You know, amazing the contradiction.
But of course, it doesn't really matter in the end that the Allied propaganda, that the Entente propaganda was exaggerated, because it was still based, it was still grounded in reality.
Yes, it matters. You just said that the war was a, quote, just and moral war. A, quote, crusade, and apparently this moralistic, quote, crusade was literally based on lies, you know? Also, what is the source for the Germans eating babies and crucifying people on the street, and for the Germans to be a warmongering gorillas and etc.? What is the truth behind that? You know, you cannot say that doesn't matter. Propaganda. People were deceived into a war. Doesn't matter how noble the war is. They were deceived that it makes whatever cause you try to defend, lose out its value. You lied to people. Don't forget, these people lost their sons. Many lost their legs. They gave their blood. For what? A lie? For a lie they were told? What about their sacrifice? What about the... it's not only about them. What about the men they shot, Don't forget, it's not only losing our son. All the mothers, in other countries will lose their sons, Because when you send your boy to war, he can die. But he also can kill someone else's son.
And-
This lie causes so many suffering, based on a lie, on exaggeration. Maybe the people to that for example, imagine a guy that joined the war because this over thinking Germans were crucifying people on the streets. Imagine if he knew that did not happen. Maybe he did not volunteer. Maybe he wouldn't have killed like someone else's son. Maybe he wouldn't have lost his leg or his eye. Don't you see the problem? There's a big problem here. You lie. That is the most disgusting thing. Deceiving people for a war. And you dare speak about morality. You dare speak about crusades. The crusades. Of course you did not went into the army. I mean, I am in the army, different from him, of course, but, of course he doesn't. This dude, what did he did in his life? He did not fight in any war. He certainly was not in World War I. He's not that old. Why doesn't he go to a war then? If he believes in bullshits. Many people regretted being in the war. Go tell that to their face. Go tell that and have some shame.
Did the German soldiers crucify farmers along the roads of Belgium? No, they didn't. But they did massacre them by the thousands. Did they really eat Belgian children? No, they did not. But they did still bayonet them and shoot them.
Massacred by the thousands. What's the source? It is very complicated to describe what happened in Belgium. But you can't hide history by using hyperbolic language to push your agenda. Also know they didn't bayonet shield. There's no source of that. At least reliable source. Because clearly, you are just throwing things in the air. Amazing. You don't play with human suffering. Human suffering is not something to be played with. History is not about sides, it's about truth. You don't play history by lying. That makes you a scumbag, which, by the looks of it, maybe that's not very far from the truth.
The rape of Belgium may have been exaggerated, but it still very much took place. The German nation was a highly militarized one, a one based largely in ideals of law, order, and discipline above all else.
The rape of Belgium happened. Yes, it did. Just like Allied lootings in Greece, or the Russians in Galicia, or the Austrians in Serbia, or the French in the Rhine. Yet people do not add the word rape before those latter events for a reason. War is not pretty. Sorry to tell you, you may think that war is, you have unicorns and whatever, and you have bubble gums in a war. But no, war is horrible. That's why people don't think World War I was pointless. People die for what? Nothing. There's a big difference there. You can do whatever you wish. You can claim whatever you want, but you still treat human suffering as this sort of propaganda machine. For the people who suffer the war, doesn't matter who does it, because in war is horrible, is nasty. War is nasty. things like this happen. They shouldn't happen. You know, they shouldn't happen. They are wrong. We can all agree on that. But you cannot blame the German nation for something that will always happen in war. You can blame the soldiers. You know, you can blame the officers. That, yes, you can. But you cannot blame a nation for something that is a natural cause of war, an unfortunate natural cause of war, but nevertheless a cause of war. The Rainbow Belgian has many reasons. We can spend an entire day understanding them. But what you cannot do is pick this very complex, situation and just blame it on the Germans. That is called propaganda. This is called dishonesty. That is called being a dirty sack of shit. You know? Also, what does Prussian ethics have to do with the rape of Belgium? Law, order, etc.? What does that have to do with the rape of Belgium? You know? What does that have to do with anything? You know? Do you know that? Like, what does order, law and order? Like, yeah, the Germans like law and order. What about it? What does that have to matter? Are you trying to portray the Germans as some sort of fascistic totalitarian regime? I mean, why else would you bring this up? It has nothing to do with the Belgians. Do you know?
They, as a nation, believed in the concept of collective punishment.
Where is the proof of that? For once, they does not exist in Germany, especially in World War I. The Kingdom of Bavaria had a very different ethics from the Prussians and the Rhine, the same way that Saxony was completely different from Baden and Silesia. Germany is a very complex construct, and during this time in particular, the difference of mentalities, ideologies, cultures, and so on was perfectly visible. There isn't, nor ever was a single German mentality. What's the source for that claim? Because it doesn't exist. There's simply no truth. There's a subjective moral judgment that has nothing to do. Something that cannot be proven. Simply something that is used to portray the Germans as, I don't know what. Something good that definitely isn't. Something good definitely isn't. And that's done for a good reason. Because I've never seen such a lying bastard in my life. Fuck my life.
If you move into Belgium and a town is found guilty of having some partisan activity, of them having blown up a bridge or blocked a roadway, trying to defend themselves from a foreign invasion, imagine such a crazy concept as that.
I don't know why this guy is trying to make resistance sound like something alien. Like, for example, if there is resistance in an occupied territory, of fucking course are the Germans going to try and enforce law and order. You know why? Because they are occupying that country and want to keep everything at bay. They want to keep resistance at minimum. What, you think the fucking Germans are just gonna stand there while fucking railways, factories, and supplies just get burnt to the ground? You really think they're just gonna stand around and not do anything?
They're gonna invite the resistance for a coffee while they burn down the train. Not only that, according to the Hague Convention of 1907, inhabitants of a non-occupied territory who, on the approach of the enemy, spontaneously take up arms to resist the invading force without having had time to form themselves into regular armored units are not prisoners of war. Resistant fighters were not considered prisoners of war, and thus were subject to martial law and the death penalty. It doesn't matter why you resist, You can have all the good reasons in the world to resist. You are not protected by the Hague Convention, If you blow up a bridge, too bad. You are not protected. And the Germans, like everyone else who in the German position, are gonna to punish you. Most likely, firing squad. Resistance was only recognized after World War II. But in the context of World War I, execution of those who resist in completely civil, those who resisted, who were civilians, etc., the execution of those was completely legal. Civilians who defended themselves were not protected by treaties during World War One. That's a big difference. Don't forget that. You cannot just pick the Geneva Convention of today, the laws that we have today, and apply them to when they didn't exist. That is dishonest.
Trying to fight to defend yourselves from a foreign occupying army of which you have no idea what they're going to do. Sure, they're saying that they're going to treat you well, but you have absolutely no genuine guarantee that the foreign army which is invading you is actually going to live up to those words. And now, yes, of course, they're saying that they give us their word that they're not going to harm us. But they also gave us their word, in I think the 1870s or the London Conference, that they wouldn't attack us to begin with.
Okay, so as we've discussed, 2 points here. One, the Treaty of London guaranteed Belgian neutrality, but it did not guarantee Belgian independence, which are two very different things. And number two, Prussia was the one who signed the Treaty of London, but the German Empire, which was invading Belgium at that time, didn't. Prussia and the German Empire were two different things at that time. They were two different things.
Not only that, in the card, yes, in the 1830s, the German Confederation of Prussia, the German Confederation was never under Prussia. If anything, it was under Austria. The German Confederation was supposed to be the replacement for the Holy Roman Empire. Austria had the control of it. So much so that Prussia could, the only time when Prussia was in charge of the German Confederation was after they kicked out Austria in the Austro-Prussian War in 1866. In the 1830s, Austria was the one ruling the German Confederation. And it was only Prussia. The German Confederation was not a political or a state like Prussia or Austria. It was a strange confederation, if anything, which had basically no power at all. Bavaria, Prussia, Saxony, they were not bound by the German Confederation. It was not the United States. You may think that it was, but you are retarded, of course. Not to mention, you can have amazing reasons to defend yourself. You can have brilliant reasons to defend yourself. If you blow up a bridge, if you protect resistant fighters, and so on, guess what, baby? You ain't protected by any treaty, and thus are to be treated like a terrorist, aka death. There's no problem there, no evil, nothing. And guess what? Every nation did that, even the British. Even the British did that. You cannot blame the Germans for something that everyone did. Well, you can blame the thing that happened. But you forget the context very easily. Mostly because it doesn't support your viewpoint, of course.
Scraps of paper are not exactly very important to the German Kaiserreich.
They weren't very important to Britain or any nation for that matter either. You blame the Kaiser for something that everyone did, my dude. I'm not sure if that's dishonest yeah, that's dishonest. I'm sure of that. But you definitely have some interesting intentions. You blame the Kaiser like some monster. You know what happened in Greece, right? If you want to blame the Kaiser, sure. If you want to blame the Kaiser, I'm all for it. But let's be consistent here, You treat the British like some superior moral authority. And the Germans like they have no morality at all. You are ridiculous. Preposterous, to say the least.
Of course they're going to defend themselves, of course the Belgians do, and in reprisal for these acts of self-defense, the Germans begin exacting collective punishment on the German peoples.
Yeah, I think we're just gonna say the same exact thing we said a couple of minutes ago, Wolfgang?
Not only that, no Belgian no Belgian prisoner of war, soldiers that were captured. None of them were they were treated like normal POWs, like the British were treated, Soldiers that were captured did not suffer collective punishment. Civilians, no. You know why? Because when a civilian takes up arms like resistance, they are not POWs. There's nothing about it, there's no secret. We go on to discuss the collective punishments and whatnot, but again, the Germans were not the only ones who did it. Does that justify the act? No. Does that justify condemnation of Germany as a so evil nation? No. Simple as. It is not a good act, a moral, good, morally good act. But it's not an act that only Germany did and the Germans are evil and no. The British also did. Let's be consistent. You treat as I said, you treat the Germans like some boogeyman. You blame a lot on them and make the British look like this superior, godly nation. I know the British think they are full of themselves. That is no secret. But you take that to an extreme, my dude. Even though you're not British, you're an American.
Which honestly just makes everything worse.
Oh, definitely.
If a railroad is destroyed, a village may be leveled. If there are indeed rumors, if there is the idea that there may be Belgian free shooters, snipers, partisans, shooting away at German soldiers, well, they would gather entire villages and mow them down, massacring them with rifle fire, with machine guns, and with bayonets. Did they eat the children? No, but they murdered them. That is sufficient in so many ways for war.
I am pretty sure that the Germans did not round up several villages, just like the guy says, just because of one partisan sniper. I am pretty sure they did not massacre entire. No, this is not one village, which could have like 100, 200 citizens, but entire villages, like villages plural. That will be a lot just for one sniper claim. Like, okay, that's just overly exaggerated.
Not only that, first of all, he has no source of it, He has no source, Yes, there were villages that, that were attacked. Why? They were armed partisans, German soldiers would go by, partisans would attack them. Partisans hide in villages. The thing about partisan warfare, is that they blend with the people, You cannot tell what is a civilian and a partisan, So what the Germans did, they look at the village and they know that village has partisans in there, It's not like the Germans just one day wake up and decide, let's randomly shoot an entire village because some hunters decide to shoot once or twice at the German troop. That's not how things work, Not to mention rifles, machine guns at this time were were things that you have to carry by truck. So you tell me the Germans went, all the way to carry a fucking huge ass piece of machinery that was a machine gun at this point, because there was no World War II style machine guns. Don't forget that. They play come on, really. There's a very big difference between propaganda and history. In history, we speak about events objectively. To say evil Germans got everyone in village and shot them all with machine gun bayonets and etc., without the source to back it up, may I add, using a scary and emotional voice tone is not history. That's called propaganda. You can they did not massacre entire villages. They did not. Simply, they're the two famous cases of German attacks on villages happen in the very complex context. Everything has a reason. Nothing is random. The Germans did not just decide to do whatever. Nor were the attacks on villages like these massacres. Yes, the Germans shot innocent. Yes, they did. But that's what happens in partisan warfare. Partisan warfare is terrible, not because it's effective, but because the civilians suffer the most, because you cannot tell what is a civilian and what isn't. The Americans suffered that in Vietnam, Even in Afghanistan, they still suffered that. It's not uncommon, imagine being a German soldier. You know that a village has partisans in there, so you go there to check on it, etc. And then you have all these men, and you simply cannot tell what is a partisan and what is not. Most of the soldiers were behind enemy lines, were recruits, young men, were very nervous. Imagine one is nervous young soldier going to a village that there are partisans there. How do you think that's gonna end? It's not gonna end pretty, that's for sure. And unfortunately, that's what happened most of the times. Young, nervous men, that were not able to say what is an enemy, what is not an enemy, and ended up doing crap. They're doing shit. That's what happened most of the times. The Kaiser did not say, go destroy that village. No. The Kaiser did not say that. The generals were more busy fighting a war than to care about what 1 or 2 Belgian villages did. You know? Don't twist history around. If you anything, blame the soldiers, the ones who attacked on the officers, because the officers are actually the ones who order it. Do not blame the Kaiser was in Berlin, who probably did not even know all this shit. That is dishonest. Even less, do not even try to blame Germany as a whole. The Germans, average German guy, did not know even all this. The German state did not support this. You cannot blame it. If you're gonna blame the Germans for this, they were bad that happened. Yes. But if you're going to blame the German state as a whole, the nation as a whole, for these events, then you also have to blame, for example, the Allies in World War II. They also committed war crimes. Are you gonna blame the American state as a whole? No. Why? Because that's war crimes, you blame the individuals. But why don't you do that with Nazi Germany, you ask? Because different from everyone else.
Because
Nazi Germany was a state that enforced that. It's different.
Yep, it's the exact same thing I mentioned earlier. Like, there's a big difference when few individuals do a war crime, and it's another thing when these war crimes are sponsored themselves by the government.
I have some statistics here, if I can put on my eyes, as far as how significant the rape of Belgium truly was, and indeed of just how much the Belgian people suffered during the conflict. Now again, exaggerated, but I think this tells a rather interesting story that's certainly not fabricated entirely.
Okay, where to start this? First of all, if it is exaggerated, then it's not a reliable historical source. And it's not even a statistic. A statistic is, and I quote, a fact of or piece of data obtained from a study or a large quantity of numerical data. And the definition of fabrication is, and I quote, false information that is invented in order to trick people, the act of inventing such information. If the data is exaggerated and does not correspond to reality, then yes, it is a fabrication, and it's not a valid source to be used. If you want to use statistic, you have to use true statistics, Just because it's based on reality does not mean it's a valid one. There's many, stories and myths, legends that are based on reality. That does not make them true. And you cannot analyze them as true and judge them. Because even worse of all, over here we are speaking about a nation of people. You are trying to judge them based on legend. Yes, the legend has an origin, that is true. If you want to judge them, then use the origin, not the legend. You only use the legend to judge something when you do not want, actually, to use the origin source. Because the original source does not back your agenda. Simple as that.
In the rape of Belgium, 6,000 Belgian civilians were killed directly by German soldiers. Not as a result of the occupation, but 6,000 people murdered by German soldiers. Perhaps, and this did happen multiple times, I believe this one in the village of Dinant, which was completely leveled, over 1,000 buildings burnt to the ground, and I think over 600 people killed, murdered in the town streets, including, of course, some people aged 90 years and older, and the youngest victim being about a month old.
I cannot understand his accent, but I assume he's either speaking about either the village of Dinant or Leuven. But regardless, I decided to do some research on the job and speak to a few friends that I have back in Belgium. And found some interesting things. Well, yes, both towns suffered massacres. There's a problem there though. At Dinant, for example, between 137 and 312 men were shot. There were no women and children among the victims though. However, the reason this happened was because the town was harboring Franc Tireur, and the Germans were met by armed civilians when they arrived. Were all those killed by the Germans resistant fighters? No, of course not. Was the German action justified? Arguably. Was it moral? No. But don't forget that at the time, it was normal for these things to happen. The Germans simply act like everyone did. You can blame it on them alone, in anything. Blame the mentality of the time, and the persons who did it in the field. At Louvain, the same case happened. The Germans knew the town was armed resistance. They were frank terror, and there was, although this time there were no armed civilians when they had. However, at Louvain, the case is even more interesting. Because in Louvain, the town was actually destroyed. Again, there is context. The Germans initially tried to gather the suspects and set fire to the houses and the cellars. And before you say, this was a common anti-partisan method at the time. Burn down the cellars and the houses of the suspected persons. Regardless, guess what? In the big town, where houses are all cramped very close to each other and made of wood, the fire spread and destroyed the town, and many people died as well. Not only Belgians, by the way, but also Germans. Confusion and chaos also spread, because the town was on fire. And from then on, you can imagine what happened, You cannot blame it alone. Yeah, the Germans started it. But they were not alone on the fault. There are many reasons, Was it bad? Yes. Was it Germany at fault? No. Were the Germans in the field at fault? Not entirely, actually. It was a combination of factors. Of course, it's easier to blame it all on the Germans. That's the lazy way to, the dishonest one. But when you don't do research, I guess that's what happens.
Why were all of these things, why were all of these people massacred? Why were all these people murdered and these villages destroyed? Well, because there were rumors of free shooters. Likely it was German firing on the other side of the village. German soldiers murder a civilian across the way. The other Germans in the column here, those are gunshots, were being fired upon, and hell is unleashed upon the village of Dinant.
Okay, so first of all, where exactly is the source for that claim? That the Germans just fired randomly after hearing a few gunshots further away? Where exactly is the source for that?
I mean, that was one of the most retarded, reasons I've ever heard. Oh boy, fuck, come on. This is objectively false, and we already said why. We already said it why.
But of course, the 6,000 Belgians who were murdered directly by German forces is really nothing in comparison to the 60,000 Belgians who were killed overall as a result of the German occupation.
I'm not going to enter into the 6,000 number of direct kills. That is a topic of debate, and there's a lot of misconceptions, and we don't even have access to all the data. But about the overall occupation, does he realize that Germany itself had a higher mortality rate than occupied Belgium? There's a shit ton of factors to consider here. The Spanish flu, also killed people in occupied Belgium. Guess what? Those that died of the flu are also counted in the deaths.
As a result of the destruction of land, the burning of villages, the expulsion of Belgian civilians, things like that.
Yeah! In a war, there's destruction. Oh my god, we have a genius among us! Einstein! Oh my god, who'd have thought that? Imagine! One ever thought that destruction existed in war? Amazing with a genius. How is this guy not having a Nobel Prize?
In addition to the 60,000 civilians who died as a direct result of this German occupation, there were another 30,000 of them who were maimed, scarred, made invalid as a result of the conflict. Some of them on temporary basis, some of them who would never recover.
Wow! Who would have guessed, Einstein? People get hurt in a war.
Well, I mean, who would imagine that when there is a battlefield literally behind your house, some bullets or some artillery shells may land in your backyard? I mean, for fuck's sake, does it know what happened in Austrian Galicia? With any part that was a battlefield? Come on! Really? The French casualties, the civilians that were living in the front lines, in the French side, under France, French people living under French, that were in the middle of the war, that were also, wounded, etc. Are they also going to blame the French state for that? Come on.
And of course, these statistics record physical acts, physical crimes, deaths, and physical maimings, if you will. It does not include, of course, the untold number, I'm sure there were a great deal, many of them, of victims whose wounds, shall we say, were more psychological than anything else.
Those statistics, if you can even call them, are worthless. Like, you are stating the obvious, my friend. Tell me something new, or something that actually matters. You know, because I don't know from where you got your statistics, but there are no accurate statistics to the casualties and everything that happened in Belgium, like in the German occupied areas of Belgium. There is no, like, you cannot have a certain. You know, most of them there is a lot of controversy to this day. You know, like, you're such an Einstein that your own statistics are with against you. You know, exaggerated statistics that you are taking as if they were truth, like objective truth. Right? When they are not. I'm not defending the Germans. I'm not defending war crimes. All I'm saying is simply history is not black and white. You know, Germany did wrong. The Allies did wrong. But why they did wrong? Was because they were murderous monkeys. No. War is ugly. These things happen. We cannot, ignore them, of course. But we cannot judge an entire nation, an entire people on that. We can't. Because if we do, we're never gonna progress as a society. World War I is a war where the ugly of humanity came. We are like, remember the Christmas truce of 1914? Soldiers did not add hate for one another. They sang, in Christmas. This was a horrible war, a war against humanity itself. Because of lies. Of bastards that lied to people to send their sons to the meat grinder. And what you do is feel this. You're no different that those guys who supported the Afghanistan invasion. You're no different than the people who said Saddam Hussein had nuclear weapons or weapons of mass destruction. In the end, you are not the one who went to the fight, who went to spill its blood. The men went. They harbor no hatred. They have no evil to say about their enemies. You know? You know why? Because in war, we are animals. In war, our most animal instincts come on top of us. If there is anyone to blame, it's war itself. No nations. Okay? If you understood that, you wouldn't be such as an idiot. A complete retarded simply. A guy who has no interest in truth. A guy who has no interest in reconciliation. All you have interest is to justify this war. To justify what is not possible to justify. You know? Just justify some moralistic garbage. Because according to you, man killing man is noble. Mothers who will only see their sons on coffins. Mothers who can never hug their sons again is somewhat noble. Men who shoot, we all have mothers. The soldiers that went to the war, they shot their other sons of other mothers. How do you think they are acted? How do you think they liked it? This is never the point of this war being pointless. It's not just we won enough. It's not the war itself was pointless. You act as World War I was a war where Britain shouldn't have joined the war. No, people do not say Britain shouldn't have joined the war. People say the war as a whole shouldn't have happened. Since the start of this, you hijacked the initial point of World War I being pointless. And it was pointless. You know why? What did you gain after the war? A few imperial possessions. And Europe, we became slaves of America. Europe lost its place in the sun. Until that point, Europe was the center of the world. We dominated the world. What did we get after? Decline. We decline as a civilization. We decline as a society. We decline. Europe declined. and we became bound to the United States. And don't even dare to tell me that we did not become slaves of America. Because if we weren't slaves of America, if we weren't bound to America, then the Great Depression of 1919 or the Wall Street crash wouldn't have affected Europe. We were forced into the American sphere. And later on, we were divided and carved up by Moscow and by Washington. That's what World War I gave us. The decline of our civilization. You can do whatever you wish to justify this decline. It was a crime nevertheless. No different than those who lied about mass weapons of destruction in Iraq. In the end, those who care the most, those who feel this, are not idiots like you who sit in a shed all day and like to LARP and defend these bullshits. Are the mothers, the brothers, the fathers. They are the ones who feel it. Because they see their sons on coffins, on boxes, returning home.
Well, that was certainly a wild ride. And unfortunately, since there is a lot to talk about here, we can't finish this video in one sitting, since that would take over 2 or 3 hours. So instead, we are going to divide this video, this response to be exact, into 2 parts. So this will be part 1, and you can expect part 2 to come out sometime in the future.
Yes, definitely. I would like to thank everyone for spending their time to listen to my ramblings. But as you can see, this man is definitely something. I've been surprised he hasn't gotten any attention, because what he says here is ridiculous, simply ridiculous. Yes, and you'll see later on. Trust me, you will see later on. It only gets worse. This guy only gets worse, and to the point he uses the Holocaust. You will see. Trust me, this guy. I mean, what do you expect from a guy who failed history and is a LARPer about Britain?
Yeah, pretty much so. Again, I would also like to thank everyone for watching this video. I hope you really enjoyed this. Leave some of your critiques down below, and we will try to answer it with best of our ability. So, this has been Lavender and Wolfgang, and we will see you all in the next video. Goodbye!
Arrivederci.